Today is a 2-for-1 because we'll be talking about 2 criminal cases, Curtis Dean Anderson Sr. and his son, Curtis Dean Anderson Jr. On a warm August day in 2000, 8-year-old Mitzi Sanchez was walking home from school, elementary school in Vallejo, California. She was headed home alone, but that wasn't a big deal because she lived in the area, and Mitzi was having a birthday party that weekend, so she was super excited to get home. Near the end of Mitzi's walk, she noticed a middle-aged man sitting in his car looking at her through his rear-view mirror. This man was none other than Curtis Dean Anderson Sr. Mitzi had an uneasy feeling about Curtis. Something inside of her was telling her to cross the street. But before she could pass him, Curtis got out of his car and asked Mitzi to help him patch up his window. Genuinely thinking that this man needed help, Mitzi agreed. Curtis asked her to reach into his car and grab a roll of duct tape on the floor. And as soon as she bent over, Curtis came up behind her and covered her mouth. And at that moment, Mitzi knew the gut feeling she had was right. This man was a creep and was clearly going to do something bad to her. She tried to scream to alert neighbors, but no one could even hear her because Curtis muffled her voice. He then forced her into the car, chained her ankles to the gear shift, and then drove off. One of the craziest details about this case is that Curtis actually drove by Mitzi's house once he abducted her, and Mitzi could literally see her mom getting things ready for her birthday party, which broke her heart because she knew she wouldn't be able to be there. Instead, she was in the scary man's car against her will with millions of terrifying thoughts running through her head. Now, at one point, Curtis pulled over at a shopping center parking lot where he made her change clothes. The creepiest part about this is Curtis actually had clothes for Mitzi to change into, which makes me think he'd been watching her and planning the abduction for quite some time. And at the end of the night, he stopped at a rest stop where he forced himself on Mitzi before putting a chain around her feet and locking it with the padlock. For the next 2 days, Curtis drove around California with Mitzi inside. Of course, no one could see her because Curtis covered the windows with blankets, and no one could hear her because Curtis threatened to execute her if she screamed. To make matters even worse, Curtis never gave Mitzi food during this period. But here's where things took a turn. So one time when Curtis left Mitzi alone in the car, he also left a set of keys inside. Those keys belonged to the padlock that restrained Mitzi. Now when she realized that, it was go time. Mitzi snatched up the keys, unlocked the padlock, escaped through a car window, and she ran for her freaking life. Curtis saw Mitzi and shouted for her to come back. Mitzi didn't fall for Curtis's BS this time and just kept running. She frantically waved at a semi-truck driver approaching her, who stopped to help. She told the truck driver, "Carl, my name's Mitzi Sanchez. I've been kidnapped." Now, Carl wasn't supposed to work that day, but agreed to pick up an extra shift. And thank God he did, because Carl called for help, ultimately leading Mitzi to safety. Miraculously, she survived the abduction and she was reunited with her family. As for Curtis, he was caught by the police and then arrested for the crime. Unfortunately, Mitzi had a tough transition back to normal life. Her story was blasted on the news, so all of her classmates and friends inundated her with questions about a trauma she was reliving over and over and over again. At the age of 16, Mitzi got into a bad car accident, which sent her to the hospital. And it was there that Mitzi found out that she was pregnant. Yeah. All these things happened to Mitzi before she even turned 17. Isn't that awful? But Mitzi's pregnancies encouraged her to get back to therapy and turn her life around. So now, she's almost 30 years old, and he's giving back to the families of missing children cases through her organization called the Mitzi Sanchez Foundation. A lot of her efforts were inspired by the difference Mitzi's case made in the lives of many other people who lost their children at the hands of Curtis Dean Anderson. That's right, people. Mitzi's abduction wasn't Curtis's first major crime, and Mitzi wasn't his first victim. Curtis eventually confessed to 10 murders, 8 in the US and 2 in Mexico. Most of his victims were young women in their teens and 20s, but they hadn't all been ID'd yet. Here's what we know for sure. The first victim was an unidentified young female runaway who Curtis murdered and dumped at a swimming hole in 1984. The second victim was an unidentified teenage hitchhiker who Curtis picked up and killed just days after the first girl. The third victim was a teenage girl who Curtis offed in 1985. The fourth victim was a 21-year-old black woman who Curtis met at a bar. He killed her and got rid of her body in Oakland Hills. The fifth victim we have a name for, Amber Schwartz Garcia. She was only 7 years old when she disappeared. Curtis saw her jumping rope on a street in NorCal in 1988 and decided to pounce. He abducted Amber and sedated her while he drove to Arizona to visit his aunt. Curtis reportedly murdered Amber at a motel in Tucson, then drove about 50 miles to dispose of her body. This case was a big deal because Amber was labeled missing for over 20 years. When Curtis was finally arrested for Mitzi's case, he confessed to offing Amber. The sixth victim was a Native American woman in her early 20s. Curtis claimed to have picked her up right outside of a bar in the Bay Area in 1988 or 89. But like Amber, Curtis took this woman to Arizona where he offed her. The seventh victim also has a name, Rosie Anderson. She was a woman of color in her early 20s, apparently with track marks all over her arm. Curtis met Rosie at a bar in San Jose. He murdered her and dumped her body in Santa Cruz. And the eighth and final victim that we know of was 7-year-old Ziana Fairchild. Her case was a big deal, so I'll give you some more information. Ziana disappeared on December 9th of 1999 on her way to school. She was quickly reported missing, but the authorities weren't able to find her anywhere. A year after Ziana vanishes was when Curtis was arrested for Mitzi's abduction, and that's when he boasted to reporters that he killed Ziana. But Curtis seemed to be like the kind of guy to lie and then brag about slaying people just to get more attention. Which is why some of the previous victims I told you about might not be true. Most of that information was from Curtis's confession to the cops, so take it with a grain of salt. All that to say, some people didn't necessarily believe Curtis when he said he had abducted and executed Ziana and disposed of her body down an embankment. Because he was so wishy-washy with his stories all the time, changing them frequently, for a while he was telling everyone that Ziana was still alive. And this got the attention of Ziana's great aunt Stephanie. Stephanie received several letters from Curtis and even visited him in prison where he was serving time for Mitzi's crime already. Stephanie told the media he would write to my post office box just his own crazy mentally ill mind, basically tormenting and saying she would be hurt. It's so sad because Curtis got Stephanie's hopes up to the point that she bought Ziana's new clothes and packed her a bag for their reunion. But in January of 2001, a construction worker found a partial skull on a rural road in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and it was a match for Ziana. Poor Stephanie was just trying to figure out what happened to Ziana, and Curtis kept toying with her emotions. On top of that, once Curtis was outed, he claimed to have recorded himself harming Ziana, which he also threatened to release, like the sicko that he is. Well, eventually, prosecutors built a solid case against Curtis. Because believe it or not, you can't convict a criminal known for lying with just a back and forth confession. Thankfully, prosecutors were able to find a few witnesses and gather more incriminating information, like the fact that Ziana's path to the bus stop fell along Curtis's cab route. He was a cab driver, by the way. With that, Curtis was charged with the crime in 2005. He first pleaded not guilty, but later switched to a guilty plea. He said, and I quote, "She's dead. It's the end. Is there a difference between a young girl and a 40-year-old woman who is dead? Dead is dead." But thankfully, Curtis was already in jail for Mitzi's case, for which he had received a 251-year sentence. So what's another 50 years to life? Curtis passed away in December of 2007 at the age of 46. The cause was natural causes due to a medical condition that wasn't released to the public. Anyway, as you can tell, Curtis was a terrible person and one who definitely should not have had children. But alas, the man had a child. His name? Curtis Dean Anderson Jr. Only narcissists give their children their exact name. Anyway, I don't really know much about Curtis Jr.'s upbringing, but what I do know is that he found himself in trouble with the law, just like his pops. And on the same day that Curtis Sr. pleaded guilty to Ziana's case, the Richmond, California Police Department announced Curtis Jr. as the prime suspect in the shooting of 31-year-old Vance Fisher. Here are some more details about the crime. At 3 a.m. on November 26 of 2005, police officers responded to 911 callers who reported hearing gunfire in their neighborhood. When the cops arrived at the scene, they found Vance's body on the ground near a garage of someone's home Vance was apparently visiting. A red Honda and a green station wagon were seen driving away from the scene of the crime. When I think this is how connected Curtis Jr. and his two accomplices to the scene, the cops found Curtis Jr. and he was later charged and found guilty of voluntary manslaughter in 2006. For that, he received a 16-year sentence, which is a little short if you ask me. Curtis Jr. would have been eligible for parole in 2023, but he received another 3 years for threatening a correctional officer. But Curtis Jr. would never live to see his parole date, because on the morning of January 21st, 2019, he was discovered hanging in his prison cell. It took 7 months for the medical examiner to officially rule Curtis Jr. passing as self-harm. Now, I don't know if 7 months is the typical turnaround for this kind of thing, but it seems a bit long, right? And one of Curtis's relatives made a public statement that she didn't think Curtis hung himself. But the examiner's report said Curtis was alone in his cell with no suspicious circumstances. And of course, if you look back at Curtis Sr.'s father, he was violent and abusive, so these genetics don't seem to be working in the Andersons' favor. That's mostly a joke, obviously. There are many other layers and factors that make people commit crimes like these, but parents and upbringing definitely play a major role in most criminal stories. Well, I think that's all the Anderson drama that I have for you today. Do you think that Curtis Sr. really executed all those victims he claimed he did? Or were some of them made up just for clout? And do you think his son would have gone on to become a criminal if his dad weren't an infamous pedophile and serial killer? Let me know in the comments. I'm Mack. Thanks for watching Killer Bites.